They say humiliation builds character, but when it comes from your own father, it builds something else fire. At my father's luxury birthday dinner, I stood there holding a small velvet box while everyone else showed off diamond watches and designer pens. Dad raised his glass and laughed. "All my kids are successful except the one who can't even afford a gift bag." The guests chuckled. I felt my face flush under the chandelier's light. But then just minutes later, his banker crossed the room and said, "Thank you, Ms. Melissa, our new billionaire partner." Mom dropped her fork. Dad's champagne glass shattered. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom sparkled like a movie set, gold-trimmed walls, crystal chandeliers, white lilies everywhere. The kind of event that looked like power itself had rented the place for the evening. My father, Richard Carter, stood at the center of it all, laughing with the same booming voice that once filled our home. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in years, not since he decided I was the family's disappointment. It was his 70th birthday, and the guest list read like the financial section of the New York Times. Bankers, partners, investors, old money polished to perfection. I didn't belong here, at least not in their eyes. My brother Nathan made sure of that the moment I walked in. "Well, look who finally made it," he said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Didn't know if you could afford the cab." His smile was camera-ready, but his words cut like glass. I smiled back because I'd learned that silence unsettles men like him more than insults ever could. "Traffic was brutal," I said, taking my seat beside Mom, who avoided my eyes like she always did when tension rose. Dinner started with truffle soup and flattery. Nathan went first, handing Dad a gold pen engraved with Legacy Builder. His wife, always one step behind him, whispered something about how he deserved it. Guests applauded politely. Then came a watch from a business partner, platinum custom made. Another toast. More applause. I waited until the noise died before sliding my little velvet box across the table. Dad's eyebrows lifted, amused. "What's this? Did the gift shop run out of wrapping paper?" Some guests laughed. Others pretended to study their forks. "It's a necklace," I said softly. "I designed it myself. The word on the pendant means integrity." "I thought—" He cut me off with a chuckle. "Sweetheart meaning doesn't pay bills." Laughter again, louder this time. I heard someone whisper, "She's always been the sentimental one." Mom reached for her wine glass. Her hand trembled slightly. The orchestra's music faltered, caught between movements, as if the instruments themselves sensed the shift in temperature. My pulse thudded in my throat. I forced a smile. "You're right, Dad," I said. "Some things can't be bought." He didn't notice the steel under my tone. Nathan leaned over and whispered, "Still making your little charity apps? Cute." I wanted to tell him that the little app he mocked now managed investments worth more than their entire company. But revenge, like interest, compounds best when left to grow quietly. Dad raised his glass high, champagne bubbling under the light. To Nathan, he said, for keeping the Carter name where it belongs at the top. He paused, eyes sliding toward me. And to Melissa, may she find a job that pays enough for wrapping paper next year. Laughter exploded again, echoing off the marble. The sound filled every corner of that gilded room, even the ones where I used to hide as a child when he scolded me for asking too many questions about his company. I stared at the bubbles in my glass. They burst quietly, one by one. At that moment, I wasn't angry. Just hollow. Years of proving myself meant nothing to him. I could have built an empire, and he'd still see the girl who failed to color inside the lines. I looked at Mom. Her eyes were wet, but she smiled anyway, the way women of her generation were taught to smile, through pain, politely, silently. I wished I could reach across the table to tell her it was okay to stop pretending. But I didn't. Not yet. The doors to the ballroom opened, then letting in a gust of cooler air. The maitre d' straightened. "Mr. Reynolds from Harrison Bank has arrived," he announced. The name rippled through the room like wind through tall grass. Reynolds was one of Dad's most important contacts, a man who could make or break fortunes with a single handshake. Dad's face lit up instantly. "Ah, Reynolds, about time you joined us. Nathan's been dying to discuss our merger." Reynolds entered tall and composed his presence, commanding even without a word. He greeted a few familiar faces before scanning the room. Then his eyes landed on me. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Ms. Melissa Carter," he said, crossing the room. "I was hoping you'd be here." The chatter stopped. Utensils froze midair. My father's expression twisted in confusion. Reynolds extended his hand. "We didn't get a chance to speak after the board approved your investment. Congratulations on the partnership. The entire team is honored to have you as our newest billionaire investor." The silence was so heavy it pressed against my skin. Mom's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against her plate. A sharp metallic sound. Nathan's smirk vanished, replaced by a cheap mask of pure white-knuckled panic. Dad blinked. What Reynolds turned to him politely. "The merger you announced tonight wouldn't exist without your daughter's contribution. Ms. Carter's firm owns 30% of Harrison Bank now. She's the reason your expansion loan was approved." For a long second, no one moved. The only sound was the faint pop of a champagne cork somewhere in the background, almost ironic. Dad's hand trembled. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor, champagne spreading like gold across the white tile. I stood calm as the room spun in disbelief. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said quietly. "Guess I could afford something after all." The banker smiled, giving me a respectful nod before moving on to greet other guests. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, the pity, the shock, the dawning realization. As I walked toward the exit, my heels clicked against the marble in perfect rhythm. Each step sounded like closure. Outside, the city lights blurred in the glass doors, a reflection of every year I'd spent trying to earn his approval. Tonight I didn't need it. He thought the gift was small. He had no idea what it cost me to earn it. People think billionaires are born lucky, but when you grow up being told you're invisible, luck isn't what you dream of visibility is. The morning sunlight in Carter Manor used to look golden, almost royal. It danced across the marble floors caught in the crystal vases and made everything seem perfect. But that light never touched me. At the long dining table, I was the quiet one at the far end, the one they barely looked at. My father. Richard Carter sat at the head, reading the Wall Street Journal, my brother Nathan beside him, explaining stock movements like a miniature version of him. My mother Margaret poured coffee for everyone but herself. "Dad, the Fed's cutting rates again," Nathan said. "We should buy into Crown equity before the price rebounds." My father nodded approvingly. "That's my boy. Thinking like a real Carter." I cleared my throat. "Maybe diversify into digital banking instead." "There's a huge gap in the Melissa," he interrupted, not even glancing up. "Sweetheart business talk is for Nathan and me. Why don't you help your mother with the table?" Nathan chuckled, the sound sharp as glass. "She's more creative than practical, Dad. You don't want to gamble on art." I forced a smile. That was my place in the family, polite, invisible, a spectator at my own life. Later that morning, I found my mother in her old art room, a space that had once smelled like turpentine and dreams. A half-finished painting stood covered under a white cloth. "You used to paint every day," I said softly. "Why'd you stop?" She kept her back to me. "Because your father prefers his walls clean." I didn't know what hurt more, her silence or how easily she accepted it. "You could start again," I offered. "You were good." She smiled faintly. "Good doesn't pay for mansions, Melissa." I wanted to tell her that good had value too, that creation wasn't measured in profit margins. But in our house, love came with an invoice. That evening, Nathan returned from a business trip in London, bragging about a new acquisition. He showed Dad the press clipping. "Carter Holdings expands under Nathan Carter." Their picture took up half the page, father and son shaking hands. I wasn't in it. I never was. "They called it a family company," I said quietly. But family was just another department I didn't belong to. Dinner that night was another ceremony of hierarchy. My father's glass clinked whenever Nathan spoke. Mine stayed full. When I mentioned a potential fintech startup idea, Dad frowned. "You're dreaming again. Leave the numbers to Nathan. You don't have a head for business." The words sliced deep because I'd spent my entire life trying to prove the opposite. A few months later, my chance finally came: a boardroom presentation. I had spent nights developing a proposal to modernize our investment strategies using digital financial analytics. Nathan sat across from me, smirking. When I finished, the room went quiet. Nathan cleared his throat. "With respect, this is a distraction. Carter Holdings doesn't play with apps. We manage real money." The older men in suits nodded. My father folded his hands. "I can't afford experiments. We deal in certainty, Melissa." "I'm not asking you to gamble," I said, voice trembling. "I'm asking you to evolve." He looked at me like I'd just spoken another language. "I've made my decision." By the time I got back to my office, the email was waiting, effective immediately. "Your position as strategic development consultant is terminated. No meeting, no explanation, just a digital goodbye." I sat there staring at the message, then packed my things into a small cardboard box. My nameplate, a framed photo with Mom, the prototype sketches of my app idea, all of it fit neatly into one box. Nathan passed by my door as I walked out. "No hard feelings, sis," he said, smiling like he'd won something. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just kept walking through the glass lobby, past the golden letters that spelled Carter Holdings into the cold rain outside. My reflection followed me across the windows, small, soaked, but upright. They said I didn't belong in their empire, I whispered to myself as I unlocked my car. They were right. I was meant to build my own. I drove through Manhattan that night with the city lights flickering like distant promises. Every billboard seemed to mock me: wealth, success, perfection, all things my father said I wasn't. But for the first time, the humiliation didn't burn. It fueled me. At a red light on Fifth Avenue, I reached for my notebook. On the first clean page, I wrote 2 words: Project Solari. That would be my beginning. The years that followed weren't glamorous. I worked at a library by day, coded by night. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that smelled like coffee and hope. Rejections piled up like unpaid bills: banks, investors, venture funds. Each email began with the same polite refusal: "Your concept lacks scalability." Still, I kept going. Interest compounds, my father used to say. He was talking about money. I learned it applied to pain, too. Every dismissal, every doubt added up, not into despair, but determination. I studied financial systems until dawn. I attended free workshops, pitched strangers in coffee shops, saved every dollar I could. Then one morning, as I sat bleary-eyed at my old laptop, an email subject line made me sit upright. "Your proposal intrigued us." It was from Harrison Bank and Trust. The sender's name, Mr. Reynolds. I read the message 3 times. He'd written, "Your model shows exceptional foresight in decentralized investment. Let's discuss a partnership." For the first time in years, I smiled, a real one, not the polite version I'd worn for my family. That day I walked outside into the pale New York sunlight. The air tasted different. Brighter. Lighter. I looked up at the skyscrapers towering over me and whispered, "They won't see me coming." Because invisibility, I'd learned, wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy. And soon the people who had once looked through me would have no choice but to look up. The night I left Carter Tower, the rain was so heavy, it felt like the city was trying to wash me away. My box of belongings sat on the passenger seat. 3 framed photos, 1 coffee mug, and a resignation letter. I never actually wrote. I remember staring up at the skyscraper through the downpour, its windows glowing like judgmental eyes. "You'll never understand the real world," my father had said. Maybe he was right. I didn't understand his world. I was building mine. Brooklyn didn't care who my father was. The apartment I found smelled faintly of mold and instant noodles, but it was mine. I painted the cracked walls white, set up a cheap folding desk, and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked in the empty document like a dare. I typed 2 words: Project Solari. I didn't know it then, but that name would one day rewrite the power map of New York banking. During the first few months, I lived on canned soup and determination. My savings dwindled faster than I wanted to admit. I spent nights learning everything about fintech. I studied the emerging blockchain models and decentralized lending platforms, recognizing that the current financial world was ignoring small investors and real innovation in favor of legacy systems. In the mornings, I worked as a freelance analyst to pay rent. At night, I coded, researched, and drafted proposals for investors who never answered. Rejection letters became my wallpaper. Your idea lacks scalability. Too risky. We're focusing on established brands. Each no was a nail hammered into the coffin of the girl my father had raised, the one who waited for permission to speak. I didn't stop, however. The clarity of the vision sustained me through the financial drought. One evening, exhausted and close to giving up, I went to a networking event downtown. I didn't belong there. Everyone wore sharp suits and sharper smiles. I was wearing thrift store heels and carrying a tote bag that had seen better days. But I stood by the buffet table pretending to sip wine I couldn't afford and listened. That's when I met him, Daniel Reynolds, Harrison Bank and Trust's rising star. The same man who would later shatter my father's arrogance with one sentence. Back then, he was just a face I'd seen in Forbes. He noticed me reading a research brief upside down, smiled, and said, "You don't look like you belong here." I smiled back. "I don't. Yet." He laughed, not mockingly, but like he understood the hunger behind the word. We talked for hours about risk innovation, how banks ignored real people. I told him my vision: a platform where small investors could access tools reserved for the wealthy. Finance should empower, not intimidate, I said. He studied me for a moment, then handed me his card. "Send me your pitch deck. If it's half as good as your conviction, I'll make time." I worked through the night rewriting that presentation. By dawn, my apartment floor was covered in coffee cups and notes. I hit send at 6:42 a.m., then sat staring at the screen, half expecting my laptop to explode. 2 days later, Daniel called. "Melissa, I've seen thousands of proposals," he said. "Yours is the first that doesn't feel like a spreadsheet. It feels like a revolution." He invited me to Harrison's downtown office, all glass and precision. I wore the only suit I owned, slightly too big from the thrift store, and prayed the receptionist wouldn't notice the tear I'd stitched in the sleeve. Daniel met me in the lobby, shaking my hand like an equal. "Don't look so nervous," he said. "They need you more than you need them." It took 6 months of meetings, negotiations, and skepticism. But slowly Solari Investments was born, a small startup backed by Harrison Bank. Daniel became both mentor and ally, pushing me when I doubted myself. Patience compounds, he'd say, echoing what my mother once whispered when she taught me to paint as a child. So does value. The first version of the Solari app went live a year later. It was rough, unpolished, and buggy, but it worked. People began to notice. A single blog post about the female founder challenging Wall Street turned into a headline in Bloomberg Tech. Downloads spiked. Emails poured in. I hired 2 interns and a part-time developer. The office was just a repurposed storage unit above a deli, but to me it felt like destiny's waiting room. I didn't tell anyone from my family. They'd have called it a hobby, just like my mother's painting or the pottery she abandoned years ago. One night, Daniel and I stood on the rooftop of the building, the Manhattan skyline glowing across the river. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked. I shook my head. "They made it clear there's no place for me." He smiled. "Then make them wish there was." Over the next 3 years, that's exactly what I did. Solari grew quietly, deliberately. We invested in green energy startups, small medical tech firms, and social impact projects that traditional investors ignored. Every success was a seed planted in silence. I didn't need to brag. Numbers speak louder than pride. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel called me into his office one Friday morning. His tone was unreadable. "Melissa," he said, "I need you to hear this from me first. Carter Holdings approached us for a merger. Your father and brother want Harrison Bank to back their expansion. I froze. You're joking. He shook his head. They don't know about Solari's stake yet. But if we go through with this, Harrison Bank will technically be part-owned by you. My pulse quickened. I mean your family's entire empire could soon depend on your capital. Poetic, isn't it? I wanted to laugh, but all I could do was exhale slowly. The irony was exquisite. The company that had exiled me would now rely on my investment to survive. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying me. What do you want to do? I looked out the window, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass towers. Proceed, I said. But keep my name off the paperwork. He smiled knowingly. You're planning something. Not yet, I replied. Revenge shouldn't interrupt compounding interest. We shook hands on it. I left his office with the faintest tremor in my chest, not fear, not doubt, but the electric hum of inevitability. In the months that followed, I watched from the shadows as Carter Holdings celebrated its new alliance with Harrison Bank. Articles appeared online, photos of my father and Nathan shaking hands with executives. They looked proud, invincible, unaware that the woman funding their future shared their bloodline. Every empire, I realized, is built on borrowed faith. And one day someone comes to collect. Late one night, as I reviewed the quarterly reports, I noticed the numbers Solari's profits had tripled. For the first time, my personal net worth crossed the billion mark. I stared at the screen at all the zeros lined up like soldiers. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt calm. I thought of my mother's voice again, soft but steady. The world only sees what you show them, Melissa. Show them gold. 5 years after leaving my father's company with nothing but a cardboard box, I had built an empire he didn't even know existed. The invitation to his 70th birthday arrived the next morning, thick cream paper embossed with gold. Join us for a celebration of legacy, it read. I picked up the small velvet box that held the necklace. The weight of it, the simple word integrity engraved on the pendant, was the only armor I needed. Legacy. I turned the envelope over in my hands, smiling to myself. He still thought legacy meant power, control, inheritance. But I'd learned a different definition. Legacy was the freedom to choose silence or to break it, and I had been silent long enough. The last time I stepped into Carter Tower, the marble floors still smelled of polish and power. I remembered how they used to shine so bright they reflected your shoes, or maybe your worth. That day, my reflection looked like a stranger's. 5 years had passed since I left. I'd built Solari from a corner of my apartment into a rising name in fintech. But now, I was back inside the empire that had cut me out, walking the same halls I once dreamed of ruling. I wasn't there to visit. I was there to watch. From the mezzanine, I could see Nathan through the glass walls of the boardroom. He was laughing, gesturing with his hands like a man too used to being admired. Behind him hung the new Carter Holdings banner legacy. Power, vision, vision. The word tasted bitter. When I had presented my fintech proposal years ago, Dad had told me to leave the vision to the men. Now Nathan was pitching digital expansion as if he'd invented the concept himself. I leaned against the railing, listening. Gentleman, Nathan said, Carter Holdings is entering a new era. With our merger plans with Harrison Bank and Trust, we'll dominate the financial sector. Harrison Bank. My bank. My name is hidden in their ledgers as MC Capital, the largest investor in their newest portfolio. I smiled to myself. So that's your big move, Nathan, I murmured. You're walking into a deal I already own. A young analyst brushed past me, whispering to another. That's Nathan Carter. He's basically running the company now. His sister used to work here, right? Yeah, the other said, lowering his voice. Got fired after a failed pitch or something. Failed pitch. That's what they called it. The presentation that could have saved the company from the outdated models they still clung to. I watched the elevator doors close and saw my reflection again, older now, sharper. The same woman, but made of different metal. The board meeting ended. Executives poured out in suits that all looked the same. Then my father appeared, surrounded by admirers. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his smile confident. He'd aged, but not softened. When he laughed, the sound filled the hallway like a gavel hitting a desk. Richard, one man said, clapping him on the back, "Your son's a prodigy." "You must be proud." "Of course," my father said, pride swelling in his voice. "Nathan's everything I hoped for. He's the future of Carter Holdings. And me, I wasn't a sentence in his story anymore. Not even a footnote." I turned toward the exit, but my footsteps slowed near the photo wall. The same black and white portraits lined the corridor, the Carter men through the decades, each holding the reins of the company like a crown. Grandfather, father, Nathan. The final frame was empty, waiting for another generation. I stopped in front of it. A small plaque read, "Next in line." I whispered, "You forgot someone." I pressed my fingers to the glass, leaving a faint print, then walked out. That night I stood by my apartment window, the city humming below. On my desk, the Solari dashboard glowed charts, numbers, partnerships. The interface pulsed with new data. Carter Holdings. Potential acquisition target pending. The irony nearly made me laugh. I hadn't planned it that way at first. Solari's investments were chosen by algorithmic precision, not emotion. But then patterns began to align. The same banks Nathan sought funding from were quietly taking Solari capital through third-party mergers. The universe had a sense of symmetry. Reynolds, my partner at Harrison Bank, called that evening. "Melissa, I've got something you'll want to hear," he said. "Carter Holdings approached us for a strategic partnership." I smiled. Of course they did. They don't know who owns our largest equity position. Want me to keep it that way? For now, I said. Let's see what kind of deal they offer. I could hear him grin through the phone. "You really are your father's daughter." "No," I replied softly. "I'm what he should have been." After hanging up, I sat in silence, the weight of the past pressing against my chest. I remembered that day in the boardroom when my father told me I didn't have a head for business. His words had clung to me for years, whispering in every failure. But now his empire was climbing the ladder I built step by step, unaware I was the architect. A week later, I met Reynolds for lunch at a small cafe near Wall Street. He handed me a folder across the table. "They want a $40 million line of credit," he said, "secured against assets you technically already own." I flipped through the documents. Carter Holdings. The signatures. My father's, Nathan's. "So they're betting on themselves," I said. "That's brave." Reynolds leaned in. "Do we approve?" I looked out the window where people hurried by in suits just like my brothers. "Yes," I said. "Approve it. But don't tell them who signed the other side of the deal." He raised an eyebrow. "You're playing a long game." "I'm not playing," I said. "I'm collecting interest." That night I poured a glass of wine and opened my old box, the one from my last day at Carter Holdings. Inside were the same sketches, the same notes, the same nameplate, Melissa Carter Strategic Development. I held it up under the lamplight. It looked small now, almost delicate. I set it beside my new one, Melissa Carter, founder and CEO, Solari Investments. The next morning, the Business News ran a feature. Carter Holdings announces upcoming partnership with Harrison Bank. The photo showed Nathan shaking hands with Reynolds. Neither of them knew that the hand Reynolds used to sign that contract was guided by mine. I closed my laptop and leaned back. "You forgot me once," I whispered. "This time, I'll make sure you remember." I could already picture it, the look on my father's face when the truth reached him, when the banker he trusted turned to thank his daughter. Not the failure, not the invisible one, but the woman who had quietly built a billion-dollar foundation beneath his empire. The storm was coming. And for once, I wasn't afraid of the thunder. The first time I saw my name on the shareholder registry of Harrison Bank, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated. It wasn't about wealth. It was about balance. Every sleepless night, every sneer from my father, every door slammed in my face had compounded into this moment. My empire didn't roar into existence. It whispered, then multiplied. Solari Investments had become a quiet storm. Daniel and I built it on precision, no press releases, no social media, no flashy interviews. Our clients came from whispers, referrals, and curiosity. Who's behind Solari, they'd ask. But Daniel always smiled and said, a visionary who prefers silence. In truth, I didn't hide because I feared attention. I hid because revenge blooms best in shadow. By the time Harrison Bank's board met that spring, Solari had quietly acquired small stakes in several regional financial institutions. 10% here, 12% there. The numbers looked insignificant individually, but together they formed a web. Daniel once joked that I was building a financial chessboard and teaching Wall Street to play by my rules. It was during one of those late-night strategy sessions that he looked up from the spreadsheets and said, "You know what I love about you, Melissa? You never raise your voice, but somehow the whole room adjusts its volume to match yours." I laughed. "You make me sound terrifying." "You are," he said simply, "and that's why they'll never see you coming." The next morning, I signed the contract that made Solari the single largest private investor in Harrison Bank and Trust. The ink shimmered faintly in the morning light, as if it knew what it meant. My initials, MC, right beside Daniel's. I stared at those letters longer than I should have. Somewhere between the girl my father dismissed and the woman who now signed billion-dollar deals, a bridge had formed a fragile one, built from self-worth and fury. "Ready to tell your family yet?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair. "Not yet," I said. "I want them to find out the way I did by accident." He grinned. "You're colder than I thought." "Not cold," I said softly. "Measured." Months passed. Harrison's merger plans accelerated, and the Carter name started appearing in trade magazines again. Carter Holdings expands into digital finance with Harrison Bank. My father's smile beamed from every photograph. Nathan looked smug beside him, his expensive haircut reflecting the studio lights. I kept the articles. Every headline was a reminder that pride is blind. One evening, Daniel called me into his office. "The board wants to finalize the merger," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "And they've requested a private dinner. You should come this time." "Why?" "Because your father and brother will be there." I froze my hands still on the folder. "They're the clients," he nodded. "Funny, isn't it? Life's poetic like that." For a moment I thought I heard my father's voice echoing through the marble corridors of Carter Tower again. "You have no head for business, Melissa." I smiled faintly on the memory. "All right," I said. "Let's have dinner." The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting made everything look expensive. Harrison executives lined the table, laughter filling the air. My father sat at the far end, glass of red wine in hand, Nathan beside him. They didn't recognize me at first. The lighting was dim, and I'd changed different hair, sharper posture, colder eyes. When Daniel introduced me as Solari's founder, Nathan's fork froze midair. My father's smile stiffened. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone caught between disbelief and amusement. "You're her." I met his gaze evenly. Last I checked, Daniel poured the wine unbothered by the tension. "Melissa's firm has been instrumental to our success. Without her capital, the merger wouldn't have been possible." My father blinked. "You mean Solari Investments funded this deal?" Daniel nodded. 30% of it. Silence. The kind that hums before a storm. Nathan broke it first. "Well, that's impressive," he said, his voice dripping with the false charm of someone rearranging their hierarchy in real time. "Guess you finally found something real after all." I smiled. "Guess I did." My father's jaw tightened. "You should have told us." "You didn't ask," I said. "Besides, I assumed business talk was still for the men." The look in his eyes told me he remembered saying those exact words to me years ago. Dinner went on polite and painful. Every compliment sounded like an apology with the sharp edges sanded off. I let them talk, nodding where appropriate, sipping wine I didn't even taste. I didn't need to gloat. Power doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly and lets others fumble for words. Afterward, Daniel and I walked out into the night. "That went well," he said, smirking. "I don't know," I replied. "I think I liked them better when they underestimated me." He laughed. "So what now?" I looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the city glittering like temptation. Now I wait. The next few months blurred into a cycle of meetings, contracts, and headlines. Solari's portfolio doubled again. Harrison Bank's profits, hit record highs. The board voted to make me an official partner, though my name still appeared only as an initial MC. Anonymous power suited me. Then one morning, Daniel burst into my office with a grin. "You're not going to believe this," he said, dropping a newspaper onto my desk. The headline read, "Carter Holdings Expansion Backed by Unknown Billionaire." My father's photo was on the front page shaking hands with Daniel. The irony was breathtaking. The unknown billionaire was me. I traced my fingers over the image over my father's smile. "He has no idea," I murmured. Daniel leaned on the edge of my desk. "How long are you going to keep it that way?" "As long as it takes," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You know, revenge usually comes with fireworks. Yours feels like a chess move." "That's the point," I said, closing the paper. "By the time the king realizes he's cornered, the board is already mine." For weeks after that, I kept working quietly, tightening the threads that bound Carter Holdings to my name. Every transaction, every loan, every investment brought them closer to me without them realizing it. I didn't do it out of cruelty, I did it because justice deserved witnesses. The day my accountant confirmed that I officially crossed into billionaire territory, I didn't celebrate. I just sat by the window of my office watching the city pulse below. I thought about the first day I left Carter Tower drenched in rain and rejection. About my mother's silent sadness about every laugh that came at my expense. And then I smiled, not from arrogance, but from peace. Revenge, I realized, isn't about destruction, it's about recognition. The moment the people who dismissed you finally see what you've become. When the invitation for my father's 70th birthday arrived a few weeks later, embossed with gold and arrogance, I didn't hesitate. I replied saying, "I will attend." This time I wouldn't come as the invisible daughter. I'd come as the silent owner of their future. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and cream-colored with gold edges that caught the light. My name, Ms. Melissa Carter, was embossed in dark ink, elegant, deliberate. For a second I thought it was another business proposal or some bank correspondence. Then I saw the crest stamped in wax, the Carter family seal. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single card. "You are cordially invited to celebrate Richard Carter's 70th birthday. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom. Formal attire." There was a postscript written in my mother's looping handwriting. "Please come, Melissa. It would mean so much." I read that line again and again, the words blurring. It wasn't my father asking, it was my mother pleading. 5 years had passed since I'd set foot inside any Carter event. The last time I'd been near that world, I'd been humiliated and fired my life stripped of purpose in a single afternoon. Now the irony was painful. The very empire that had dismissed me was running on the liquidity my company provided. My father didn't know that every check he signed had my quiet signature behind it. The same evening, Reynolds called. "I assume you've seen the invitation." His tone carried amusement, like he already knew my thoughts. "I have. They're going to announce the merger with Harrison Bank at that party. Nathan's making it his victory lap." I walked toward the window, watching the lights of New York flicker below. "Perfect," I said. "I will attend." He hesitated. "You sure you want to do that?" "This could get messy." "Messy," I smiled faintly. "No, it's symmetrical." For a long time after we hung up, I stood in silence. The city outside my window hummed with energy horns, sirens, lives intersecting, and I realized how far I'd come. The girl who once left Carter Tower in the rain was gone. I was no longer invisible. But something about that envelope on my desk made my stomach twist. I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. There's a difference. Revenge feeds on anger. Closure feeds on truth. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of imagining his face when the truth surfaced. 2 days later, I met with my stylist. She pulled out a series of gowns, each more extravagant than the last. Sequins, silk, metallic golds. I shook my head. No, something simple. Understated. She raised an eyebrow. "It's your father's birthday at the Whitmore Grand. Understated isn't the language they speak there. Then they'll have to learn a new one. We settled on a sleek black dress, clean lines, minimal jewelry. It wasn't about wealth. It was about power that didn't need to shout. For the gift, I knew immediately what to bring. I had a small silver box, custom-made, engraved with one word: integrity. Inside, a single white lily preserved in glass. It wasn't expensive, but it carried meaning my father would never grasp until he had to. The night before the party, I barely slept. I replayed every moment of my past: the boardroom dismissal, Nathan's smirk, my father's laughter, as he told me I didn't understand business. Those moments used to haunt me. Now they motivated me. In the morning, my phone buzzed with messages from journalists, investors, and friends. Solari's valuation had quietly crossed $3 billion. A handful of insiders knew who I was behind the curtain, but the public didn't yet. I turned off my phone and stared at my reflection in the mirror. "You don't owe them a performance," I whispered to myself. "Just presence." When I arrived at the Whitmore Grand, the air smelled like money, perfume, whiskey, and ambition. The lobby shimmered under chandeliers the size of cars. Guests in designer suits and gowns clinked glasses, talking about mergers and politics. At the entrance, a hostess smiled politely. "Name, please, Melissa Carter." Her smile faltered for half a second. "Of course. Welcome, Ms. Carter." As I stepped inside, the sound of a string quartet filled the ballroom. My father stood at the center of it all, glowing in the attention, surrounded by powerful men who spoke his language: numbers, profit, legacy. My mother sat nearby, radiant, but tired, her smile, the kind worn from years of keeping peace. Nathan spotted me first. His grin faltered. "Melissa, you actually came surprised, honestly?" "Yeah. I didn't think you'd want to revisit old wounds. Sometimes you have to see the wound to realize it healed," I said calmly. He laughed, the sound uneasy. Still poetic as ever. My father turned then. For a second I thought he wouldn't recognize me. His expression froze, a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "Melissa, Dad, didn't expect you'd make it." "Neither did I." He studied my dress, my poise, my quiet calm. "Well, I hope you came to celebrate, not to make a scene." I smiled faintly. "That depends on how the evening goes." He forced a laugh, dismissing me with a nod to his guests. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to speak with my daughter for a moment." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I trust you'll behave tonight. There are important people here." "Of course," I said. "You wouldn't want them to think you've lost control." His jaw tightened. "Don't start." "I didn't." "You did 5 years ago." Before he could respond, the event coordinator announced dinner was being served. Waiters poured champagne. The lights dimmed and the crowd settled around the long, glittering table. I found my seat near the far end, across from Nathan. My gift box sat neatly beside my plate. Everyone else's presents gleamed in gold wrapping paper and velvet ribbons. Mine was small silver and quiet, an insult by their standards. During dessert, Dad rose to give his speech. "Tonight isn't just about age, it's about legacy," he said, voice booming. "I built Carter Holdings from nothing. And I'm proud to say that legacy continues through my son Nathan, who's finalizing our biggest merger yet with Harrison Bank." Polite applause filled the room. Nathan beamed, raising his glass. Dad gestured toward me, then almost as an afterthought. "And to my daughter Melissa, well, maybe next year she'll bring a gift that doesn't come from the discount store." The table erupted in laughter, the kind that stings. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, steady, silent. My mother's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against the china. That sound silenced the room for half a beat. Then over the murmurs, a deep voice came from behind me. "Actually," said a man I knew all too well, "this entire celebration wouldn't be happening without her." Every head turned. Mr. Reynolds stood at the entrance, immaculate in a tailored suit, the golden light glinting off his cufflinks. He smiled, eyes on me. "Good evening, Ms. Carter. I wanted to thank you personally for making our partnership possible." My father's expression was drained of color. "Our partnership," Reynolds nodded. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Harrison Bank's newest billionaire partner, your daughter." The silence that followed was thick enough to break glass. And then somewhere near the center of the table, something did. My father's champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The lights of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, each one reflecting off polished glass and golden cutlery. From a distance it looked beautiful, flawless even. But beauty had always been my father's camouflage. Beneath all the glitter, the cracks had been there for years, just waiting for the right pressure to break. The orchestra played something expensive and forgettable. Guests swirled champagne, talked mergers, exchanged air kisses that smelled of money and ambition. I stood near the bar, unnoticed, invisible by choice. My black satin dress wasn't as loud as the sequined gowns around me, but it didn't need to be. Real power doesn't need sparkle. It radiates from stillness. From across the room, I watched my father command the stage like the CEO he'd always pretended to be. Nathan hovered beside him, wearing arrogance like cologne. Their laughter carried over the music, rich, booming, performative. The same laughter that used to fill our house when I was little, right before I'd say something too smart and ruin the moment. Daniel leaned close, his voice low. "You're sure about this? I didn't take my eyes off the stage." "Completely." He nodded once, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Then let's make sure he never forgets tonight." At that moment, the host's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Carter and his sons, children, for a toast to legacy and success." I laughed quietly. Children, singular in his mind. Daniel glanced at me. Not for long. As my father took the microphone, the room hushed. 70 years, he began, his tone reverent, self-satisfied. 70 years of hard work, sacrifice, and family. I built Carter Holdings from the ground up, every brick, every deal, every success. And tonight, surrounded by my family and partners, I'm reminded that true wealth isn't measured by what we own but by the legacy we leave. He lifted his glass eyes, glinting under the chandelier. To family and to the next generation who I hope will continue to honor the Carter name. Polite applause filled the air. I clapped once slowly. Then I stepped forward. "Beautiful speech, Dad," I said, my voice clear enough to slice through the noise. Heads turned. The orchestra faltered mid-note. My father blinked, caught off guard. "Melissa," he said, forcing a smile. "You made it." "How nice. Wouldn't miss it for the world," I said, moving closer. "After all, I wouldn't want to interrupt your legacy celebration." Laughter rippled uncertainly through the crowd. Nathan rolled his eyes. "If this is about that little app again," I turned to him. "You mean the one funding your expansion loan?" His smirk faltered. My father frowned. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, the ballroom doors opened. A tall man in a navy suit entered, Daniel Reynolds, calm as ever. The banker from Harrison. The man my father had spent months chasing for approval. "Mr. Reynolds," my father said, seizing the opportunity to redirect attention. "So glad you could join us. I assume everything's finalized for the merger?" Daniel smiled politely. "It's all finalized, yes. In fact, I was just speaking with our newest primary investor." Dad chuckled. "Well, whoever they are, tell them I said thank you. Couldn't have done it without their support." Daniel turned his gaze steady on me. "You just did." Silence. I could hear the faint clinking of a glass somewhere in the back. Mom's hand froze midair, a fork suspended between disbelief and dread. Nathan's face went pale. My father blinked twice. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Daniel gestured toward me. "Mr. Carter, your daughter is the principal investor in the Harrison-Carter merger. Without her, none of this would have been possible." It hit him like a slap. The room buzzed with murmurs. People turned their heads, whispers spreading like wildfire. My father's face flushed crimson. "That's absurd. She doesn't have that kind of money." I smiled. "You said the same thing about my ideas once." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough. "What is this? Some kind of stunt?" "No," I said softly. "This is recognition," Daniel added. "To clarify, Ms. Carter's firm, Solari Investments, now owns 30% of Harrison Bank, and by extension 12% of Carter Holdings." The sound of glass breaking cut through the silence. Dad's champagne flute falling from his hand. Shards glittered like diamonds across the marble. I didn't flinch. You once told me I couldn't even afford a gift bag, I said. Turns out, I bought your company instead. A nervous laugh came from somewhere quickly stifled. My father's lips trembled, his mask slipping. You planned this. For 5 years, I replied. Every investment, every meeting, every silence was part of it. You taught me how to win Dad by underestimating your opponent. Mom's voice cracked from the table. Melissa, please. I turned to her gentler now. Mom, you don't have to defend him. Not tonight. She looked away, tears glinting in the candlelight. Nathan stepped forward, trying to salvage what remained of his pride. This doesn't change anything. You'll never run Carter Holdings. I tilted my head. I don't need to. I just own it. Daniel cleared his throat. If I may, he said, addressing the stunned crowd. It's rare to see such a vision realized. Ms. Carter didn't just build a company, she built an ecosystem. Harrison Bank is proud to partner with her. The applause started slowly, hesitant, cautious. Then louder. Investors, executives, people who smelled opportunity faster than loyalty. My father's eyes darted across the room, panic replacing pride. The empire he'd spent his life building was slipping through his fingers, not because it failed, but because he'd never thought to look beneath his own table. He opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough for him alone. Happy birthday, Dad, I said. I didn't bring a wrapped gift this time. I brought perspective. He stared at me, speechless. Mom rose quietly, placing her trembling hand on my arm. You've made your point, she whispered. Please, I softened. I didn't come to humiliate him, Mom. I came to end it. The orchestra, uncertain of its cue, began to play again, softly, tentatively. Guests murmured, their attention divided between fascination and discomfort. Daniel leaned in. You did it, he said quietly. I exhaled. No, I said. It's just beginning. As we walked toward the exit, I caught my reflection in the ballroom's mirrored wall. The girl who once begged for approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who no longer asked for permission. Behind me, I heard my father's voice crack for the first time in my life. Melissa, wait. I paused, turning slightly just enough for him to see the calm on my face. For what I asked. He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know how. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The city hummed below, indifferent and alive. Daniel hailed a car, but I stayed still for a moment, watching the golden light of the ballroom spill onto the steps. You okay? He asked. I smiled faintly. Better than okay. He nodded. Then what's next? I looked back one last time. Inside that ballroom, my father's empire was unraveling not from scandal, not from ruin, but from truth. Next, I said, stepping into the night. Now we build something real. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds of my penthouse like a blade. I hadn't slept much, not because of regret, but because silence had a different texture after truth had been spoken aloud. For the first time in my life, my father knew who I truly was. The daughter he mocked for not affording a gift bag had just outbid his entire empire. And yet as I sipped my coffee and stared at the skyline, the victory didn't feel loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the night of the birthday. Reporters, investors, former colleagues from Carter Holdings who suddenly remembered my number. One headline from the Wall Street Ledger read, "The unknown Carter, the billionaire behind Harrison Bank's rise." I scrolled past it, feeling nothing but exhaustion. Every text began the same way. Congratulations. We always believed in you. Lies in digital ink. Then one message stopped me cold. It was from Mom. Can we talk? Her words were cautious, like she was afraid they might break something fragile between us. An hour later, she was standing in my living room, still the picture of Grace, but with tired eyes that revealed sleepless nights. She looked around at the minimalist furniture, the soft light, the absence of noise. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Peaceful. Peace can be lonely, I replied. She sat down, clutching her purse in both hands. Your father didn't mean to humiliate you last night. I gave a small, humorless laugh. He's been practicing that art form for years, Mom. I think he meant every word. She hesitated. You have to understand him. He built everything from nothing. He doesn't know how to handle being outdone by his daughter, I finished. Her silence was enough. For a while we just sat there, two women bound by the same man's shadow. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out something small and folded the invitation to the party, creased and smudged. I wrote that note, she said softly. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did, she whispered. For years I've watched him dismiss you, your ideas, your dreams, and I did nothing. That's my shame to carry. Her voice broke then, a sound so rare I almost didn't recognize it. But last night when Reynolds said your name, when he said billionaire partner, she stopped, blinking away tears. I dropped my fork because for the first time I realized you didn't need any of us to see you. You'd already become everything he told you you'd never be. Something inside me cracked, not from pain but from release. I didn't do it to hurt him, I said. I did it because I couldn't stay small to make him comfortable anymore. She nodded slowly. I know. But it hurt him anyway. He won't admit it, but it did. I wanted to say good, but the truth was more complicated than satisfaction. It wasn't joy, I felt it was clarity. Does Nathan know? I asked. Her lips tightened. He does now. He's furious. Says you humiliated the family. I looked out the window, the skyline mirrored in the glass, like another version of me, the one who used to care about their approval. The family humiliated itself long before I did. She stood to leave, but before she reached the door, she turned. For what it's worth, Melissa, I'm proud of you. Not for the money. For surviving him. After she left, the silence returned heavier this time. I turned on the news, just to fill it, but every channel echoed the same story, the Carter family scandal. The daughter's silent empire. The fall of the patriarch. It wasn't supposed to be a scandal. It was supposed to be a reckoning. By afternoon, my assistant called. Ms. Carter, the press is asking for a statement. Do you want me to issue something official? I hesitated. No statements. No interviews. But they're already spinning it. Your father looks, I don't want to defend myself. I want the noise to fade. She paused. Understood. I ended the call and walked to the balcony. The wind off the Hudson was sharp, bracing. Far below, people hurried through their own lives, unaware they were walking through the fallout of a dynasty. Then a voice behind me said, You really made a mess of things. Nathan stood in the doorway, uninvited, still in the same tailored arrogance he'd always worn. You broke into my building? I asked. He smirked. You're not hard to find. The whole city's talking about you. I crossed my arms. Then maybe you should listen. You might learn something. He stepped closer, his tone dripping with false composure. You think you've won? You made Dad look like a fool. You tanked our stock. Investors are panicking. Funny, I said. Your definition of our is very selective. This isn't about you being right, he snapped. It's about loyalty. Loyalty? I almost laughed. To what? The company that threw me out. He looked around my apartment, eyes narrowing. You built all this off our name. No, I said softly. I built this despite it. You can call it betrayal, but I call it balance. His face flushed with anger, but there was something else beneath it, fear. The kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you thought. Dad's not well, he said finally. You broke something in him. I froze. What do you mean? He hasn't left his study since last night. Keep replaying that scene. The glass. The silence. For a moment, guilt flickered like a shadow across my chest, not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I knew the kind of pride that couldn't bear a mirror. He brought this on himself, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending not to see it. Nathan looked at me with something almost human in his eyes. Maybe. But remember this, Melissa, when empires crumble, the dust doesn't care who caused it. It covers everyone. He turned and walked out without waiting for a response. I stood there long after he'd gone, the city humming below, the wind colder than before. Maybe he was right. Maybe the truth wasn't a clean act. Maybe it always left residue, the kind you couldn't wash off with money or apologies. But as the evening sun painted the skyline gold, I knew one thing for certain: I'd rather stand covered in dust than sit polished in his shadow again. And for the first time in my life, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. For weeks after the party, the city felt different, slower, quieter, as if New York itself was holding its breath after what had unfolded that night. My father hadn't spoken to me since. Not a word, not a message. The Carter mansion, once so loud with laughter and ambition, had gone eerily silent. But silence doesn't bother me anymore. It's where I built my empire. The headlines did what I never could: they told the truth. Billionaire daughter funds, her family's own company, Carter legacy, now controlled by mysterious investor Melissa Carter. Every outlet from Bloomberg to Forbes ran some version of the story. Most of them painted me as a prodigy, a financial visionary who turned exile into empire. None of them mentioned the humiliation, the hunger, or the nights I fell asleep at my desk with unpaid rent notices on the floor. They only saw the ending, not the cost. But the story that mattered wasn't in the papers. It was in the boardroom. 2 weeks after the birthday party, I attended my first meeting as Carter Holdings' largest shareholder. I arrived 10 minutes early, deliberately. The conference room was cold, sleek, all glass and chrome, the kind of place built to intimidate. I used to feel small here. Not anymore. Nathan was already inside, flipping through reports, his jaw set tight. He didn't look up when I entered, but I caught the flicker in his reflection, anger mixed with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. "Morning," I said. He exhaled sharply. "You had to do it like that, didn't you, publicly? In front of everyone. Transparency is important in business," I said lightly, taking the seat at the head of the table, the one my father had always reserved for himself. Nathan's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just walk in here and run everything? You're not one of us." "Funny," I said. "I thought family made me one of you. But if we're talking merit, well, you've been running this company for 10 years. The stock hasn't moved in 5. He clenched his jaw. "You don't understand how this works." I smiled. "Oh, I do. That's why I built something that does." The door opened and my father entered. He looked older, thinner, paler, his confidence dimmed. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. For the first time in my life, he didn't fill the room. "Let's begin," he said finally, settling at the opposite end of the table. "We have work to do." The meeting was mechanical: financials, performance reports, projections. But under the numbers, the tension pulsed like a living thing. When it ended, everyone filed out quickly, pretending not to notice the standoff that remained. When the last door clicked shut, my father finally looked at me. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. "Was what worth it?" "This," he said, gesturing around the empty room. "The humiliation, the spectacle. Turning your own family into a circus for your revenge." I met his eyes. "You call it revenge. I call it balance. You built an empire on exclusion, on deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. I just evened the scales." He leaned back, exhausted. "You think you've won? I didn't come to win, Dad," I said softly. "I came to stop losing." He didn't respond. Maybe he finally understood that this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. "You look like someone who just went 12 rounds and didn't realize she'd already won," he said. I laughed weakly. "You were there. It didn't feel like victory." "It's not supposed to," he said. "Reckonings never do." That night I drove to my mother's house. It was smaller than I remembered, cluttered with the quiet remnants of a life once shared with him. She was in the kitchen arranging flowers into a chipped vase. "I saw you on the news," she said, not turning around. "Let me guess, they called me ruthless." She smiled faintly. "They called you brilliant. But I know that look in your eyes, Melissa. It's not brilliance that keeps you awake at night, it's the cost." I leaned against the counter. "He made me invisible for years, Mom. Now he can't stop seeing me." "Isn't that justice, Justice?" she said softly, isn't about making others see you. It's about seeing yourself." I didn't answer. The flowers she was arranging, white chrysanthemums, caught the light, reminding me of the vase she once made before she gave up painting. I thought of her hands, roughened by years of being dismissed, still capable of creating beauty. "Do you ever miss him?" I asked. Her eyes lifted to mine. "I miss the man he was supposed to be." We didn't talk about it again. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected email from Harrison Bank's board, an invitation to speak at a global finance summit in London. Topic: Redefining Legacy. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. When I landed 3 weeks later, the skyline looked like a promise I hadn't made yet. The auditorium was filled with executives, journalists, and analysts who'd once ignored my calls. I stood on stage, breathing slowly as the lights dimmed. I reached inside my blazer, feeling the simple metal of the integrity pendant beneath my fingertips. I used to believe legacy meant inheritance. I began. That it was something passed down, not built. My father taught me otherwise, though not in the way he intended. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you reclaim. The applause that followed wasn't for my words, it was for the story they all thought they knew. But stories have layers, and mine wasn't done. When I returned to New York, Daniel was waiting in my office. His tie-loosened sleeves rolled up. "You stole the show," he said. "Half the investors in Europe want Solari now." "Good," I said. "Let's make them work for it." He studied me for a moment, then smiled. "You've changed." "Not really," I said. "I just stopped apologizing." That night I took a walk through the city. The same streets I used to rush down years ago, clutching resumes and coffee I couldn't afford. Now people moved aside when I passed. Not because of money or fame, but because I carried something invisible yet unmistakable: authority, earned, not given. As I crossed the bridge, the skyline shimmered on the water, and I thought of something my mother once said: value isn't what others assign to you. It's what survives when they stop believing in you. My father still hadn't called. I didn't expect him to. Some silences are permanent. Some wounds never ask to be healed. But that night, standing under the hum of city lights, I realized something had shifted inside me. For years, my life had been defined by what I wanted him to see. Now it was defined by what I saw when I looked at myself: power, peace, and a future that didn't need his approval. As I turned back toward home, the wind caught my hair and carried it across my face. I smiled. The world finally felt balanced. And for the first time since I left that tower years ago, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I was walking toward everything that was finally mine. The first headline hit like lightning. Harrison Bank secures Carter Holdings acquisition with record capital injection from Solari Investments. And beneath it, in smaller print, founder and CEO Melissa Carter spearheads the deal. By 8 in the morning, my phone was a war zone of calls, messages, and congratulations. But I didn't answer any of them. I sat in silence on my balcony, the New York skyline washed in dawn light, coffee cooling beside me. It had taken 5 years to get here, 5 years since the day my father told me I wasn't cut out for business. And now the empire he built was mine. Not through inheritance, through execution. The official meeting to finalize the acquisition was set for 10 o'clock at Harrison Tower. Reynolds called just before. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, though his tone carried a smile. "Ready," I said, staring at my reflection in the glass. "I've been ready since the day he fired me." When I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was electric. Men in $1,000 suits sat around a long mahogany table, their chatter dying instantly when they saw me. Reynolds stood near the head, motioning me forward. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "allow me to introduce the new majority shareholder of Carter Holdings, Ms. Melissa Carter." A few jaws dropped. One man's pen clattered to the table. My father, sitting at the far end, went pale. The veins in his temple stood out, his hand frozen mid-motion over a document. Nathan sat beside him, his eyes darting between us, confusion giving way to dread. I walked calmly to my seat, placing my folder in front of me. "Good morning," I said. "Shall we begin?" For several seconds, no one spoke. Then my father exhaled sharply like the air had been punched out of him. "This is some kind of joke," he said. "It's not," Reynolds replied, handing him a packet. "The papers are signed. The transfer cleared overnight." Dad's hand trembled as he flipped through the documents. The color drained from his face as he reached the final page, my signature. "This can't be right," he muttered. You're my daughter." "Yes," I said quietly. "And your new partner." Nathan pushed his chair back, disbelief etched across his face. "You can't do this, Melissa. This is family." I turned to him. So was I once. The room went still again. The only sound was the sharp intake of Richard Carter's breath. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, it was almost tangible. The men who once ignored me in these same halls now avoided my gaze, unsure how to treat me threat or savior. I leaned forward, folding my hands. Let's be clear. This isn't personal. Carter Holdings was drowning in debt. Solari's acquisition saved it. You needed a bailout. I provided one. You just didn't know whose hand you were shaking. Reynolds suppressed a grin. The rest of the board members exchanged uneasy glances. My father's voice cracked. "You planned this." I met his eyes. "No, I earned this." He stood suddenly, his chair scraping the floor. "You think money gives you power over me? Over this family? I don't think so," I said evenly. "I know it. Because you taught me that money is what defines worth. I just learned to play your game better than you did." For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then he sat back down, deflated, as if the weight of his own lessons had finally crushed him. The meeting continued, formalities, signatures, clauses. I maintained my composure, letting the meticulous data and the weight of my position speak for me while my father struggled to find his voice. Every word felt surreal. The same man who once called me naive was now signing over controlling shares to me. When it was done, Reynolds stood. "Congratulations, everyone," he said. "Carter Holdings now officially operates under Solari Capital's umbrella." Polite applause followed, though it sounded more like surrender than celebration. As the room cleared, my father remained seated. I lingered too, waiting. When the door finally closed behind the last executive, he looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, not pride, just fatigue. "Why Melissa?" he asked softly. "Was it revenge?" I hesitated. "No, it was redemption." He gave a bitter smile. "And what does redemption buy you?" "Peace." I looked out the window, the city gleaming below like a living organism. "No," I said. "Control." He nodded slowly, almost approvingly. "You really are my daughter." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm not your shadow anymore." He said nothing after that, just stared down at the signature line on the contract, my name written where he used to be. Then he stood and left the room without another word. Nathan followed him, but paused at the door. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "Maybe. But I'll never forget it." That night, the city's skyline shimmered like gold dust. My office lights burned late as I reviewed the transition documents, the empire now under my command. Every number, every asset, every piece of property. It was overwhelming, not because of the magnitude, but because it had always been within reach. Around midnight, I walked down to the lobby. The security guard nodded respectfully. "Big day, Ms. Carter." "Yes," I said softly. "A long time coming." Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of Manhattan taxi sirens, the endless rhythm of ambition. I looked up at Carter Tower, my tower, and felt something strange, not triumph, not vengeance, but stillness. Sometimes victory isn't fireworks. It's the quiet realization that no one can take your name away again. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. A text from Reynolds. "The media's calling it poetic justice." "Want me to confirm your involvement?" I typed back one line. "Let them wonder." Then I slipped the phone into my pocket. The city lights reflecting in the glass doors behind me, like stars rearranging themselves around a new constellation. The tables had turned, and I was finally sitting at the head. The morning of the shareholders' meeting arrived, cloaked in quiet tension. Outside Manhattan was still waking up taxis slicing through the mist like yellow streaks of purpose. Inside Harrison Tower's main conference room, the air was electric. Everything smelled like polished marble espresso and ambition. The kind of morning my father had always lived for. Except today, the stage wasn't his. I stood by the panoramic window watching the city below. My reflection looked composed, almost cold, the kind of face that could sign or destroy empires with a pen stroke. I learned that expression from him. Somewhere behind me, the door opened and closed softly. "You ready?" Daniel's voice low and steady. "I've been ready for years," I said without turning around. He stepped beside me, straightening his tie. "This isn't just another deal, Melissa. Once this goes public, your father's control ends. Completely." "I know." I smiled faintly. He taught me what control costs. At 10 sharp, the board filed in. Nathan came first, his expression sour, followed by the directors, all men who used to look right through me during company dinners. My father entered last. He looked smaller somehow, though he still carried that posture of command that had once made even seasoned bankers stumble over their words. When he saw me at the head of the table, something flickered in his eyes. Disbelief, then anger. "You don't belong in that seat," he said quietly. "I bought it," I replied. "It came with the company." The room went still. Even Daniel glanced down to hide a smile. "Let's begin," I said, pressing the button on the remote. The screen behind me came alive with graphs and projections, Carter Holdings' performance over the past decade. Declining revenues stalled innovation, ballooning debt hidden behind creative accounting. I didn't raise my voice once. The data spoke louder than any insult ever could. When the last slide faded, I looked directly at my father. "This company was built on your vision. But it's dying from your pride. Today that ends." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with restrained fury. "You think you can do better?" "I already have," I said. "You just never looked close enough to notice." Daniel took over then, outlining the details of the restructuring plan, merging Solari's technological branch, with Carter Holdings' infrastructure replacing 2/3 of the current leadership and transferring all voting power to the majority shareholder. Me. My father's hands clenched into fists. "This is mutiny." "No," I said calmly. "This is succession." Nathan slammed his palm against the table. "You can't just erase decades of work," I turned to him. "I'm not erasing it. I'm rebuilding it. You've spent 10 years protecting your father's legacy instead of expanding it. That's why the market left you behind." He glared at me. "You don't understand the Carter name." "I understand it perfectly," I said, my voice cutting clean through the tension. "It used to mean excellence. Now it means ego." The board members exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. Even those loyal to my father were shifting the scent of inevitability too strong to ignore. The tide had turned, and everyone in the room felt it. Finally, one of the older directors cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter," he said, addressing my father, "the numbers don't lie. Ms. Carter's proposal is persuasive." My father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "You're all fools if you think she can run this company." Daniel met his glare evenly. "You said the same thing about her app, Richard, the one currently valued at $7 billion. The silence that followed was complete. You could hear the hum of the projector cooling down. I folded my hands on the table. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm exercising ownership. The vote is a formality." My father's face went pale. "You wouldn't." "I would," I said, "and I am." One by one, the directors cast their votes. When the final tally came in, the verdict was unanimous, 11 in favor, 1 opposed. He was the one. The rest of the board rose and left quietly murmuring polite congratulations. Only the 3 of us remained, me, my father, and Nathan. He sank back into his chair, staring at the polished surface of the table like it might offer him a way out. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said finally. "You think taking everything from me will fill that emptiness?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No. but it stops you from pretending it doesn't exist. His voice broke then, not in anger, but something smaller, sadder. You were supposed to be my pride, Melissa. My daughter, not my rival. Something twisted in my chest, but I didn't let it show. For a flicker, the man who once terrified boardrooms looked almost human, trapped by the ghost of his own making. You raised me to compete. You just never thought I'd compete with you. He didn't answer. For a man who had conquered boardrooms and headlines, silence was his final defeat. Nathan stood abruptly. I'm done, he said, his voice shaking. You can have it all. The company, the name, the mess. I'm done trying to live up to both of you. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed. Then it was just the two of us. For the first time, my father didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man facing the end of an empire and realizing his own child had written the final chapter. I didn't want to destroy you, I said quietly. I wanted you to see me. He lifted his eyes, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw something human flicker there. Regret, maybe, or the faint recognition of everything he'd underestimated. I see you now, he whispered. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come. When I walked out of that boardroom, Daniel was waiting by the elevator. How'd it go? He asked, though his expression already told me he knew the answer. It's done, I said. He nodded once. So what now? I pressed the elevator button, watching the numbers descend. Now, I said, we rebuild on truth this time. The elevator doors slid open, and for a moment I saw my reflection in the mirrored steel, poised, composed, steady. I wasn't the girl begging to be believed anymore. I was the woman no one could ignore. As the doors closed, I whispered to the silence, legacy isn't inherited. It's reclaimed. And when the elevator reached the lobby, I stepped out not as Richard Carter's daughter, but as the architect of everything that came next. The first snow of the season fell over Manhattan like quiet applause, soft and slow. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office, I watched the flakes drift against the glass, dissolving into nothing. It was peaceful in a way that power never is. 6 months had passed since the acquisition. 6 months since the night my father's champagne glass shattered across marble, marking the moment his empire fell into my hands. The world still hadn't stopped talking about it. The prodigal daughter turned billionaire. The empire reborn under new blood. Headlines came and went, interviews requested and refused. But I'd learned something in those months, that no business degree could teach the cost of silence is always cheaper than the price of attention. I poured a cup of coffee and leaned against the window. From up here, the city didn't look cruel, it looked small, manageable. Below me, people hurried through slush and traffic, unaware they were walking under the glass kingdom built from my family's collapse. A soft knock pulled me from my thoughts. It was Reynolds, carrying a folder thick with contracts. The final reports, he said, placing them on my desk. Solari's value just crossed $7 billion. You've officially outgrown the Carter name. I smiled faintly. That was always the goal. He nodded, studying me. And yet you look unsatisfied. I'm not sure satisfaction was ever the point, I admitted. When you spend half your life chasing validation, it's hard to recognize peace when it finally arrives. He paused, then slid a small envelope across the desk. This came by courier this morning. Handwritten. My chest tightened before I even touched it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, my mother's. Inside was a short letter. Your father isn't well. He's been asking for you. He won't say it, but I think he wants to see you one last time. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the paper back into the envelope. For months, I had convinced myself that chapter was over, that I had closed the book cleanly, permanently. But family doesn't vanish. It lingers in the spaces between achievement and memory. I'll take the afternoon off, I said quietly. The drive to my parents' estate felt longer than it should have. The city melted into suburbs, then into silence. The mansion loomed as it always had, tall, cold, timeless, a monument to pride. When I entered, the air smelled faintly of cedar and age. My mother met me in the hallway. her eyes red but steady. "He's upstairs," she whispered. "He hasn't left his study in days." I climbed the stairs slowly, the sound of my heels echoing off marble. The door to his study was half open. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing shadows across the room. My father sat in his old leather chair wrapped in a blanket smaller than I remembered. Time had taken the arrogance from his posture, leaving only the man underneath. He looked up when he heard me. "Melissa." His voice was weaker than I expected, fragile almost. "Dad." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken things. Finally, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." I did. He studied me carefully, his eyes tracing the details of the woman I'd become, the confidence, the restraint. "I read about you every week," he said. "You've done what I couldn't." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean build something without destroying people?" A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "Maybe that too." He coughed, the sound harsh against the quiet. "I was wrong about you. About everything. I thought control was strength. I thought humility was a weakness. But you turned both into something I never understood." I looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in the glass of the old family portraits. "You didn't believe in me, Dad. You made sure I knew it." "I did," he admitted. "Because I saw too much of myself in you, and I hated it." That confession hit harder than I expected. He leaned back, his voice lower now. "I used to think legacy meant what you left behind. But it's not. It's who carries on after you're gone, and how they do it. You didn't just inherit the Carter name, you redefined it." For the first time in years, I didn't know what to say. He glanced toward the window where snow pressed softly against the glass. "When you left, I told everyone you'd fail. I wanted to believe it, but deep down, I think I knew you wouldn't. I just couldn't handle being wrong." The air between us felt thick, not with anger, but with truth. "I don't need your apology," I said finally, "but I'll accept your honesty." He nodded slowly. "That's all I have left to give." We sat in silence for a long while. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking each second like a heartbeat. When I finally stood to leave, he spoke again. "I'm proud of you, Melissa." I turned. His eyes glistened with the weight of something too old for regret. "I know," I said. "You should be." Outside, the air was cold and clean. My mother waited by the car, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," I said. He needed to say it. I needed to hear it. That's all. On the drive back, the city lights appeared again, flickering through the falling snow. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest lifted. 2 weeks later, I stood on the stage at Solari's annual gala. Cameras flashed, journalists shouted, investors toasted. The company's new slogan glowed behind me on the LED screen: "Integrity is the highest form of wealth." I looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces that saw me not as Richard Carter's daughter, but as Melissa Carter, founder, visionary, survivor. When I spoke, my voice was calm. We build things to last, not to impress. And sometimes the hardest part of success is learning that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just frees you from it. Applause rose warm and genuine. After the gala, I walked alone through the quiet corridors of the building I now owned. The reflection in this glass showed a woman who had walked through humiliation, betrayal, and silence, and had come out not invincible, but whole. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city shimmered under a full moon, clean and new. I took a deep breath and whispered to the night, "You were wrong about me, Dad. But I still became everything you hoped for." Then, turning toward the camera crew packing up at the back of the hall, I smiled. "If you've ever been underestimated," I said softly, "don't wait for someone else to see your worth. Prove it to yourself. And when you do, tell your story, so no one forgets." I let the applause wash over me, feeling the quiet pulse of the room. Like, comment, subscribe. And remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't power or money. It's peace.